Welcome back to the GBC Podcast. I'm excited to have Pastor Josh back with me. We get a chance to talk about some things that matter to us that we're dealing with usually on Sunday mornings from the pulpit. And we had an opportunity this morning to be able to ordain some deacons to deacon ministry, both be able to participate in ordination for new deacons, and then also electing deacons that have already, previously been ordained. But we get a chance to sort of bring them on to serve the church body. And so we get a chance to participate in all that. And so in our time of preaching from the pulpit, we talk about what deacon ministry is and sort of the characteristics or qualifications for a deacon. But I want to take a few extra minutes in the podcast to be able to sort of talk through that, maybe in a little bit of a conversational way about what deacons are and some things that maybe we don't get a chance to talk about from the pulpit, and which I think is really important for the church family. And one of the reasons that we do this, why I've wanted to do deacon ordination on a Sunday morning, in particular this time anyway, is to really sort of draw attention to the importance of the deacon office. I believe it is considered an office in the New Testament. And there's stuff that we have in the Scripture about what a deacon is qualified, or how he is qualified to serve as a deacon. But what I think is really interesting about it is that we don't get a description of what a deacon does. We get a description of who a deacon is. There's a really big difference there. Our church, we describe for our deacons what we do. Right.
Certain roles and functions.
That's right. What they should be about and all that. But the Bible really doesn't go into that necessarily. We sort of have to read a little bit in sort of some of the things that are implied and some of the other passages that fit into that.
We can see a situation where the deacon office arose, and that gives a little hint too.
That's
but
right. There's
never really a bulleted, here are the roles and responsibilities and duties, the job description.
So we have to sort of shape that for ourselves as to what our expectations are based on what the Bible is. But I just think it's really interesting, our deacons have such a really critical role and office in the church, but there's not really a job description for that. And so let's talk through that just a little bit. We'll talk through what deacon ministry is. So you've sort of, we hear us talk about, when we talk about deacons, they're really the word, let me back up. The English word deacon only shows up really a couple of times in our English translations. It shows up in Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, where Paul is addressing elders and deacons, or he makes that part of his address, elders and deacons. So it's in the English translation, it's given there as a particular office. And then it's given in 1 Timothy chapter 3, which we looked at in the sermon. 1 Timothy chapter 3.
It's kind of the go-to always on deacons.
That's right. Verse number 8, where it mentions the word deacon as the particular office. And that's really it. Outside of that, you don't have anything that mentions that particular English word or name, deacon. Now, the word deacon itself, though, the original language, the Greek word that we get that word deacon from, shows up over 100 times in the New Testament. But the English word deacon only shows up a couple of times. So there's an explanation for that, right? So let me do it this way, and then we'll get into a little bit of maybe the passage or the sort of characteristics / job description. But it's good for us to understand that the word deacon in English is actually not a translation of a word. It's what we call a transliteration of a word.
Just dropping it right in the text, it was.
That's right. So the Greek is diakonos, and so rather than translate it, they just created a new English word out of that Greek word. So they just kept the sound of the Greek word, which is diakonos, and just called it deacon, okay, as an official kind of title or office. But the word diakonos in the original language simply really means to serve. There's some connotations of that word, where that word actually comes from. It means to serve by kicking up dust.
Right. There's so much back and forth movement that the dust is pumping up.
That's right. So that's sort of what the word means, actually. It's just sort of a word that means to serve. It's a real similar thing if people are familiar with the word baptize, right? The word baptize found in the New Testament is a transliteration. It's not a translation of the word. It's a transliteration of the word. The word
Sounds
in
like
Greek,
it.
it sounds like it. Baptizo, they just sort of created a new English word called baptize, coming from the Greek. So it's a similar thing. That happens other times in the New Testament. The word deacon is not the only time that happens. So it becomes basically its new word, deacon, but it is a word that's that's given to us many, many times in the New Testament to describe what a deacon does.
Used in lots of places, but not necessarily talking about the office. And we see it used talking about servants and other things throughout.
That's right.
Lots of times.
That's right. So you'll see a lot of times in the New Testament we're taught as disciples of the Lord to serve. That's a lot of times the word that's there is the word that we get the word deacon from. It just simply means to serve. So that helps us to understand that a little bit, why that office, the title actually only shows up a couple of times, but the concept is there all the way through the New Testament a lot of times. So in particular, though, this passage in 1 Timothy chapter 3 is really the only passage that we have that gives a description of deacon in any kind of list form, all right? So we have right before that in 1 Timothy chapter 3, the first 7 verses, a description of an overseer or a pastor or an elder. A lot of those terms are interchangeable, I think. And so we find a description of the character or qualifications of an elder. And then right after that, beginning in verse number 8, is the description or a list of the characteristics of a deacon. Now, another thing that I think is interesting is that list in the first 7 verses of an elder shows up another place in the New Testament, which is in the book of Titus.
Another pastoral epistle.
That's right. And so he gives a list of qualifications or character qualifications or character traits of an elder, but he doesn't give another list of deacons in Titus. He only gives it here in 1 Timothy. So with that being said, let's talk about this, all right? And then we'll get into the sort of the characters. So, all right, so your opinion, all right? What's the difference between the characteristics given here and the job description of a deacon, what they actually do? So this is who they are, and then we sort of shape what they do. What is the difference, and then how do those two things sort of tie together? What do you think?
I think a big piece is when you look at the characteristics, there is a genuineness, a humility. Their identity is settled in Christ already. It's what they are is there, and then all these actions and activities that we talk about them doing flow out of that. Instead of us saying, all right, well, we're going to start adding responsibilities to you, and you're going to just rotely do them, that just doesn't fit. It becomes flowing out of the character and the nature that they already have, that they begin doing these works so that when they're raising up the dust, it's not out of self-promotion, it's not out of getting into a position, they already are living a genuine life and a Christ-following life. And I think because of those qualifications, then they flow out of when they're doing these roles and responsibilities.
Well, it's a good point, because he actually mentions in here that a deacon ought not be greedy for money. In other words, it seems like maybe in Paul's day there could have been a little bit of this interest in grabbing at power within the church, that grabbing at a status in order to make a living, to do that, making money off of their status and their power. And so one of the things that Paul says is he ought not be greedy for money. In other words, he ought not be doing what he does for financial gain. He ought to be doing it for service. He doesn't describe what that is exactly. He doesn't describe like what kind of activity he's supposed to be doing. But he gives us, so to your point, the whole list is about the character of a person, not about what that person does. So one way to simplify it, I think, should be this way. Any church that elects deacons ought to elect men first who are not necessarily defined by what they're doing, but defined by who they are. No deacon ought to be elected or appointed to serve in a church that doesn't have these characteristics. No matter how good of a servant he is, no matter what he's involved in, how powerful he is in the community, no matter what he does as a businessman, no matter what he does, none of that matters more than this.
Right.
Because it's very important to Paul that this is what matters most, is the character of a man.
You can build all those other things on top of this character.
That's exactly right. And so we've gone through the list, and so I won't spend a lot of time going through the list here on the podcast, but we should look at it, though. Verse number 8, he says, deacons likewise, and there's that word likewise, which sort of ties what he's about to say in these next few verses to what he just said in verses 1 through 7. So what he means by that, I think, is just like the elder or the pastor has a list of characteristics that ought to define him, likewise the deacons ought to have a similar kind of thing. And so, matter of fact, some of these things in the passage about deacons are similar to what comes before. Mm-hmm. There's certain things that are missing, which we've talked about in the sermon, but some of these things are important for us to see. So it says, should be worthy of respect, not hypocritical. That word hypocritical we mentioned means not double-faced, not two-faced. In other words, a deacon shouldn't be somebody who is
one way at church and one way at home.
That's right. That's a good way to say it. Not drinking a lot of wine, not greedy for money. There's that greedy for money thing again. Holding the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. They must also be tested first. Now, I'm going to make a comment here about that, which we talk about, especially when it comes to deacon ordination, is that any man who serves as a deacon ought to have first been tested. He goes on to say, if they prove blameless, then they can serve as deacon. If they don't prove blameless in being tested, their character being tested, then they ought not
be a deacon.
Serve. Mm-hmm. That's right. So one of the ways that churches commonly approach deacon ordination, which is wrong, but unfortunately it is fairly common. I've heard people say things like, when it comes time to, not here at Germantown, I haven't been here long enough for somebody to say it yet, but what I hear a lot of times in my past ministry experience is, well, we ought to give him a chance to serve as a deacon. That will make him more faithful.
Oh, maybe he'll plug in and he'll stick around and he'll be
maybe
dedicated.
He'll come to church every Sunday if we make him a deacon.
It's getting the cart before the horse.
That's exactly right. Maybe he'll be interested in serving if we make him a deacon. Well, that's looking at it backwards. He says he ought to be tested first, and only then should he serve as a deacon. So I think, what we mean here by testing, there's a couple of things probably. Most churches have a period of testing or some type of interview or formal investigation into a man's character or his practices or whatever before he's actually allowed to be put on a ballot to be elected as a deacon or whatever. And that may be some of what he's talking about here is there ought to be some kind of formal test, But I think really what he's talking about is an informal testing. In other words, there ought to be, for every man that serves as a deacon, there ought to be really a church body as a whole over a period of time watching.
Right, they're seeing it.
Yeah. Is he already serving? Is he already proving himself to be a man who loves the Lord, who's spirit-filled? Does he lead his family well? Does he have a good reputation in the community? There ought to be already a church that is already watching these things informally, not necessarily taking notes on a guy, but informally watching. And I think that's more what Paul means by this testing here. And I think a church that sees that of a man ought to then come to the conclusion that, this man's already
right.
He already has
God's at work doing this in his life.
That's right. He already has this character. His character traits already match all these things, and he's already serving here. So let's formally make him a deacon.
So the title and the status catch up with what's already going on in his life, what God's already doing.
Perfect way to say it. And I think that's what he's talking about here. So I think we can sort of see both, maybe a formal test, but also the informal test, I think, is just as important, if not more so, according to what Paul's talking about. So he then goes on and says, wives too must be worthy of respect, not slanderers, self-controlled, faithful in everything. Now, verse 11 is an interesting verse, and we don't have time to get into that in a sermon. But here I just think it's worth mentioning that there's disagreement on verse number 11 across the board as to who he's talking to here. So there are two main views, two main ways, and I'm not saying we're going to solve it here in the next few minutes of a podcast, but I think it's worth mentioning at least. Because anybody who does good Bible study, looking at commentaries, are going to run across problems here.
And lots of different views on what it means.
That's right. Even within our own church family, maybe. So two main views. One is that he's actually now talking about the wife of the deacon. So he starts verse 8 talking about deacons should be this way. Verse 11, he shifts gears to talk about the deacon's wife, that she should be worthy of respect, not a slanderer, self-controlled, faithful in everything. And then in verse 12, he shifts back to the deacon that he was originally referring to in verse number 8. So that's one view. He's talking about the deacon's wife. The second view, which is, again, also popular, is that the word wives in verse number 11 can also be translated women, not the wife of that deacon, but a woman, meaning that many believe that he's now shifted gears to talking about women who also serve as deacons. So that you have the role then, if taken that way, then you could have men and women who also serve as deacons. Now, again, and I will say this again, we don't have time to solve the whole issue because it's been an interpretive issue forever and ever and ever. That goes way back for ages in commentaries and people who wrote on scholar, and even now contemporary commentaries are still commenting on this and still disagree.
And so often our mindset we come to the text with influences how we interpret it as a casual reader. Someone growing up in a Baptist context, they read through this, and that second option probably doesn't even cross their mind.
That's right.
They just automatically go to, this is talking about the wife of the deacon.
That's right.
But someone coming from a different context, they might see something different.
They might see it differently. They might refer, or they might prefer the different translation of the word rather than wives, maybe prefer women. So anyway, I just, not that we're going to solve it, but that if you're going to be a Bible student and begin to dig deeply here, verse 11 will cause you to trip up a little bit, just because there's an interpretive issue here or a translation issue too. So wives too, and whether or not, I will say this, whether or not you're thinking of a deacon's wife or of a deacon, a woman who is serving as a deacon, necessarily, as far as the character traits, don't really matter, right?
It's all still good stuff that we want to see in the deacon and the deacon's wife. That's
right. And we should see this in any woman in the church as well as these other characteristics of any man in the church. So worthy of respect, not a slanderer, a self-controlled person, which is just a fruit of the Spirit. That Paul actually mentions that in the book of Galatians, where he mentions the fruit of the Spirit. Self-control is in that list. Right. That's for every Christian.
You would hope we'd see that coming out of a deacon.
That's exactly right. Or a deacon's wife. Yeah, that should be in everybody's list of things, right? Faithful in everything. And then verse 12, deacons are to be husbands of one wife. So there he has switched back to, depending on your view here, but he has switched back to talking about the deacon should be husbands of one wife, managing their children and their own households competently. Now, I've served with other deacons, many deacons before in my past, who have had problems within their family life. And I've served with deacons who have come and said, you know what, because of what's going on in my family right now, I need to step down as a deacon. I can't say that I'm managing my own household right now. Maybe deacons that are experiencing marital problems or problems with their children right now as they're raising them just feel the need to say, you know what, I don't know if I exemplify this right now, and so I just need to step back a little bit, take care of my home, take care of and then step back into that role of a deacon. And I will say, as a pastor, that I think that's an exceptional example. I believe men need to be discerning enough to say, you know what, I can't really care for my church well if I'm not caring for my family well. And I don't know that I'm being a good example of this characteristic. And so I just need to take a step back. I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think that can be a good thing.
Yes.
And a good example and a statement for a church family. Now, I will say that I need to say this because I've just said that. There is nothing in this list that, in my opinion, should keep anyone from serving as a deacon if they've had a problem with anything of this in the past. In other words, some might say, well, boy, look at how he raised his children. Now they're raised and they're off on
maybe
their own
having kids of their own by this point.
And they think, well, he didn't do a good job raising his own kids. Well, that was 40 years ago. Is he disqualified forever from being a deacon because he didn't do that really well? Well, go back and look at the other ones. What about if some point in his life he was a gambler? He was really greedy for money. Maybe that was way back in his life before either he got saved or before he began to really walk closely with Christ. Does that automatically disqualify him as a deacon forever? Well, some people might say yes, but I have a real problem with that because I really believe that if we hold any of these things, maybe mistakes in these areas of their life in the past, we hold any of that over them, then I'm not so sure that speaks well of what we think about the cross. I think we ought to have a greater view of the effect of the cross in somebody's life.
And the transformation that happens through it.
Exactly. The grace of God in overcoming some things than to hold over people to say, well, they messed up one time in their life with that, or that kind of thing. I'm just saying I think we need to be real careful with how we approach what the grace of God does in the person's life in bringing them to faith and bringing change in their life. I don't think the point of this whole passage was a way that Paul is saying, hey, when you get to serve as a deacon, everybody needs to take this passage and just sort of hold it up and
this
point
is the
it at
report
you.
card, the litmus test.
That's right. Like boy, you're not going to get in if, I don't think that's the intent of the passage. I think the intent of the passage is to say that anybody who aspires to the office of a deacon, their life, as we measure it, as the church family measures it, their life needs to be held up to these characteristics. If he doesn't fit this, this is a pattern of his life, then he ought not serve as a deacon. And I think that's the intent. I think that's what Paul's getting at, is this ought to be the pattern of his life, that he ought to be a man of character and integrity. And so I think that's the point. So again, he doesn't say anything in there about what a deacon does. Really, all this is about who he is. Now, real quick though, and I'm spending all the time talking, which I just want to get to, because I think this is really critical to the ministry of a church. But though, when we start looking at job description, what he actually does, help us understand a little bit real quickly about where that comes from. Where do we get this out? I mean, where do we come up with in the Bible anything that he does?
I think we go right to Acts 6, and you see where they're setting apart some, because there's the disconnect of the serving of the Lord's Supper, and how do we make sure this is getting done? And it's drawing the pastoral team away from studying the Word and praying and dealing with administration and serving, and so they set the gentleman apart to help it, as an extension of that pastoral office, to care for the widows and care for what's going on with the Lord's Supper. And we see them helping function alongside. That's
right. So even get in that passage in Acts 6 a little bit more about who the person really is. But we do get a little bit of the job. And some people have called Acts chapter 6 maybe a precursor to the deacon office. It doesn't actually ever say anything about a deacon. Of course, at some point, you had to create the office. It didn't exist at some point. And so in Acts chapter 6, the office of deacon didn't exist. But that may have been the precursor to that office, which Paul is now talking about, 1 Timothy chapter 3, where it grew out of. There's a problem. They need to meet that need. Got to meet that need somehow. How are we going to do it? They appoint these men, 7 men, get them together and say we're falling short in this particular area. And these pastors, these elders get together and say, if we do that, then that's going to take us away from the ministry of the word and prayer. And so these men were chosen by the church. They fit that role. They can do this. They're full of the Holy Spirit, good character, and they were put in a position to be able to fill that space and be able to serve the needs of the church body, making sure everybody's taken care of, and that was sort of that job description. We're sort of shaping what these men ought to do, and then let these pastors be able to spend their time, or the bulk of their time anyway, preparing to preach the word and to pray for the congregation. So yeah, Acts 6 is really what sort of shapes our view about what deacons actually do. 1 Timothy chapter 3 shapes our view of what deacons actually are. So there's sort of the difference there. But anyway, it's a great privilege for us as a church to be able to ordain men to serve who will step up, say, that's what God's calling me to do. I want to step in. I want to serve my church family, partner with and share ministry with our pastors, and be able to do that together, work hand in hand with each other. And I think a church that has a healthy deacon body in the end will be healthier as a body because of men who serve them well.
Definitely.
So anyway, we're grateful at Germantown to have great men like that. So anyway, it's been fun. Let's close it. We'll catch up with you next time on the GBC Podcast.